Good evening. We'll go ahead and get started with a prayer. If you bow with me. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this time to set aside to study your word, to bring praises to you. Help us to do so with a clear mind. Be with those who couldn't be here tonight to share in the opening of your word. Help them to make it back safely the next time we meet. Thank you for all the blessings you give us, Lord, and thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ, that you sent to die on the cross for our sins, for the remission of our sins. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.
Good evening. Join me, please, in 1 Samuel chapter 24. 1 Samuel 24. We are going to look through some things here in this section and see what we can come up with. It's an interesting section because you have David doing what is, well, not your first instinct. You have David sparing the life of King Saul, and it's kind of an interesting section overall because of where we are in the story. King Saul is trying to kill David. David has opportunities to respond, and he doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is because, well, Saul is the Lord's anointed. That's what he says. 6 different times in these chapters, in chapter 24 and in chapter 26, 6 different times, David refers to King Saul as the Lord's anointed. And that's the reason why he doesn't take his life. And so that's what we're going to spend our time talking about. Not so much just following the story, because most of you are very aware of the story, but really getting into why does David have this reverence and this attitude toward King Saul when King Saul is obviously not doing what he ought to be doing in this situation and not living as he ought. So just really quickly, in chapter 24, David spares King Saul at En-Gedi, and then in chapter 25, we take a break from David and King Saul, and we go to David and Nabal and Abigail. So we have that story. And in that section, David learns some restraint. He is taught restraint by Abigail, Nabal's wife. We'll talk about it just a little bit. And then in chapter 26, David has another opportunity to take the life of King Saul, and he does not do it. That's how the 3 chapters kind of lay out. Now, we'll review that just a little bit, and then we'll get on to some observations about it. You can see the map, but you probably can't see what's on the map, so we'll zoom in a little bit and show you the area that this is taking place in. It is most of it is south of Jerusalem. There's a little bit that goes on in chapter 25 north of Jerusalem, but most of it is south of Jerusalem. You might be able to see, if I can make my pointer work here, you might be able to see right down here, Carmel, right down there, or Carmel. That's a part of what's going on. And then south from there is the wilderness. Down into here is the wilderness where David will spend some time in chapter 25. So you can kind of get an idea with the map of where all of this is happening. I know sometimes that is helpful. So chapter 24 now. Chapter 24. Saul makes his way into a cave where David and his men are hiding. What's interesting about this is it is Saul, and if you look at chapter 24, the second verse, it is Saul and 3,000 chosen men from Israel. Saul has gathered up 3,000 folks to go out and find and kill David. He happens into a cave where David and his men are. And so David has an opportunity to take Saul out of the picture. It says, if you look with me, it says in verse 4, the men of David said to him. Now you can picture this. They're in the cave, and David's guys are saying to David, behold, this is the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about, verse 5, afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So, verse 6, he said to his men, far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. It's the first time that David refers to him in this section as the Lord's anointed. And he offers that as the reason why he did not seek revenge on King Saul. David knows Saul's trying to take his life. David's aware of that. David's men are aware of that. And they look at this as a marvelous opportunity. They say, well, look at this. Can you imagine this? This has worked out just fine. And you and I look at this story from the standpoint of the providence of God working the whole time. That's what we see from our perspective. In fact, in chapter 26, we'll see direct evidence of the providence of God working there for the two of them to meet up again. But we see that here. David and his men are living in that moment, and they probably don't see that as clearly as we do. They just see the opportunity to remove the biggest problem and biggest threat they have, but David won't do it. And his logic is he is the Lord's anointed. He says it 2 times there in verse 6, and then he will say it 5 more times throughout this section. His logic is we can't do that. The Lord put him in place, and it is not for us to do that. So, he says it again down in verse 10, and the way the story goes, they end up parting. They have conversation, they part. That takes us now to chapter 25. Chapter 25 begins with the death of Samuel. It says in verse 1, then Samuel died, and all Israel gathered together and mourned for him and buried him at his house in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. That is the southern area there, as you can see on the map, off of our map actually. David goes down there, and David encounters then the shepherds and some men who work for a fellow by the name of Nabal. Read verse 2 with me of 1 Samuel 25. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about while he was shearing his sheep in Carmel, it says parenthetically in verse 3, this man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. Interesting parenthetical there. It describes the woman, it describes the man. She's lovely, he is the opposite of lovely. Then it describes him as a Calebite, who, of course, Joshua and Caleb, the ones that made their way into the promised land out of the generation that did not. And this is a part of the land that Caleb was granted when they came into the land. And so it makes sense that he would be a Calebite, a descendant of Caleb, but he is in no way like Caleb. He doesn't operate the way Caleb does. It says again in verse 3 that he was harsh and evil in his dealings. He has a run-in with David through some of their men. David has encountered his men, and David has worked with them. And so look at verse 5. David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, go to Carmel, visit Nabal, and greet him in my name, and say this to him. And here's what they were to say, verse 6. Have a long life, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we have not insulted them, nor have they missed anything all the days they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David. So they bring that kind of a request before Nabal. Very respectful. It is almost a subservient kind of request. It is as respectful as it can be. And David throws in, we've been working with your guys and everything's been fine. We have a good relationship here. Verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? If you just stopped there, you might think he doesn't know who David is. You might think he says, I don't know who this David is. He knows exactly who this David is. Look at what he says next in verse 10. There are many servants today who are each breaking away from their master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered from my shearers and give it to men whose origins I do not know? He has heard about David. He has heard about Saul, and he casts David here as a runaway slave, kind of, as someone who ought to be home serving, but he's not home serving. He took off. And that's the way he describes David. Well, David's men go back and they tell David what happens, and you can imagine his response. The text says, if you look with me in chapter 25 and verse 13, David says, put your sword on. That's the way he responds. Put your sword on. We're going to go kill the guy because of the way he has responded. It says in verse 14 down through verse 17, one of the young men went and told Abigail. That's why she's mentioned earlier in the passage, because she's the one who plays the greater role in all of this. One of the young men who was aware of all of that, who worked for Nabal, goes to tell Abigail what's really going on. It makes me wonder if this sort of thing has happened before. If the men who work for Nabal have had occasion from time to time to go to Abigail and say, we got a problem here. It just makes me wonder about that. I have no idea, but it doesn't seem like an out of the ordinary kind of a thing, and the way she responds might lead us to think that is possible. But it says in verse 15 and 16, this is how Nabal's young man describes to Abigail the relationship they've had with David and his men. Here's what he says. Yet the men were very good to us, verse 15, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went about with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us, both by night and by day, all the time we were with them, tending the sheep. And so the way he portrays it is they protected us. They contributed to the goodness that we enjoy with the flocks. They were active helpers with us. And you know how the story then goes. Abigail goes to David, and she meets him. She actually gathers up an interesting thing, if you'll look with me in verse 18. She gathers up quite a bit of supplies to take to David. But look at what it says in the New American Standard, at least in verse 18 of chapter 25. Then Abigail hurried. Now listen to what she did when she hurried. And took 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. She hurried, and she gathered up quite a bit of stuff. And she's going to take all of this to David and his men to try to make things work out. She does that. David responds. In that process, she says in verse 25, please do not let my lord, that is David, pay attention to this worthless man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is within him. She just tells it like it is. This is the circumstance, and this is where we are. And that's another reason why I wonder if we haven't been down this road before in that family, just quite possibly. The way it works out is David says, okay, thank you. In fact, David turns around in verse 32 and said, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be the discernment that you have. So she helps David understand that he does not need to act rashly. If you go back up into verse 30 and 31 of the chapter 25, basically what she says to David is, you don't want to do this. This will create a problem for you, and it's not the kind of person you want to be. Verse 30, and when the Lord does for my Lord, that is, when God does for David, according to all the good that God has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not cause a grief or troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause and by my Lord having avenged himself. She said, you don't want to be the avenger here. It's not worth it. And when you do become king, they knew who David was. She understood a little bit about David. When you do become king, you don't want to be the guy who did this. She offers him really wise counsel in a moment when he's really fired up. It is also significant, I think, that all of this occurs after the death of Samuel. And so David might be in maybe not the best of moods and attitudes, and he certainly has a vengeful attitude, and so Abigail comes and makes all of it be okay. It says down in verse 38, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died, and you know what happened after that. When David heard that Nabal was dead, Abigail then becomes David's wife. That gets us through chapter 25. Chapter 26 is another opportunity for David to spare Saul. This one is definitely, by inspiration, arranged so that it occurs the way it occurs. Saul is out again with his 3,000 men looking for David, and they have camped somewhere. David has heard that they're out looking. He is aware of that. He comes upon them. And so the way it's described in the text is the camp kind of makes a circle with the king kind of in the middle. The king is a bit protected. He's in the middle of all of his folks. And that makes sense to us. But what happens is David and Abishai come to the people by night. Verse 7 of chapter 26, verse 7. And behold, Saul lay sleeping inside the circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. And Abner, that would be his commander, Saul's commander, and the people were laying around him. Then Abishai said to David, and this is perfectly obvious. Abishai says, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore please let me strike him with the spear into the ground with one stroke, and I will not strike him a second time." David's servant says that God obviously arranged this. This is perfect. The spear is right here. It's already standing right here in the ground beside his head. We could just take care of this right now. But again, verse 9, David said, "Do not destroy him." And then he asks a question. He makes the statement in the form of a question. He says, "For who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" How are you going to do that, is what he says. What's on the other side of that, is the question. Okay, let's say we do that. Now we have guilt. And so that's the way David looks at it. And then David says in verse 10, the Lord's going to fix all this. One way or the other, somebody's going to strike him. He's going to die. Some battle is going to take his life. Somehow, some way, the Lord's going to take care of this. This is not our job. And so, they do not. They do take his spear, and they take his water jug, and they go across the way, and then they yell back and say, "Looky, looky what we have." And that creates all sorts of problems. And then again, Saul responds with a degree of remorse. This is where Saul says down in verse 21, "I have played the fool and committed a serious error." Saul has the ability from time to time to recognize that he has made grievous mistakes, and his pursuit of David is wrong. But he can't stick to that. He can see it from time to time, but he just can't stick to it. And then that kind of wraps up the story there. So there's more detail, but I want us to get on to what do we do with this? What do we do with this business of it's the Lord's anointed, and that being the reason why David will not strike Saul and respond to Saul. So some general principles, and then we'll go to some Bible references that could be helpful for us. First general principle for us is what or who God appoints must be respected. Now, some of these are going to be hard for us. We're going to go right through them, and then we're going to look at some passages that have to do with why. Why is it like this, and why do we take this position? What God appoints, the system God appoints, who God appoints, should be respected. The idea in our text is God had authorized Saul to be the king. David did not have the authority to undo that. God knew when he authorized Saul to be king who Saul was. And God knew what Saul would do. And God knew how all of that was going to play out. David didn't know, and Saul didn't know, but God knew. And so for David to interject himself would be placing himself at odds with what God had authorized or anointed or put into place. All of these principles, at least for me, are challenging from time to time, and that's why we're going to do the class this way, to get to some of the hard parts of being a Christian. What God appoints and who God appoints must be respected. It does not mean that what we do with what God has placed under our power or in our control is always right. It just simply means, well, that Saul was the Lord's anointed, and David did not have the authority to remove him from that position. Next in line with that is the righteous person cannot do evil to remedy evil. And that's what David says. What are we going to do if we take his life? How are we going to deal with that guilt? Yes, what Saul is doing is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. In many ways, what Saul was pursuing in Israel, aside from David, was not right. But David's principle is we cannot do wrong in order to fix wrong. That doesn't solve the problem. It convolutes the whole thing. Yes, sir? Yes, later on in the story, that is correct. That is correct. He is committed to, this is the Lord's business, even though I don't understand why I'm on this end of it and how it's going. And what's another interesting fact about this and David regarding Saul being the anointed? What's another interesting fact about David at this time? Yeah, David's been anointed too. It's just not his time yet. It's a fascinating circumstance where David has to have faith and trust in God's system and in what God has put in place, even though David does not understand it. So the righteous cannot do evil to remedy evil. We can't go the wrong direction to say we're making things go the right direction. And sometimes that's a bit of a challenge for us.
Our parents would have said
Two wrongs don't make a right. That's good. That's good. The next point in line with all of this is personal vengeance is not God's righteous judgment. Sometimes we get that confused. Sometimes we think if I step in and solve the problem, then that will somehow be on behalf of God, and that will make everything all right because I'm operating on behalf of God. To quote my dad, God doesn't need your help. He never has needed your help. He never will need your help. He doesn't need you to interject yourself to make things right. He is plenty able to do that. I have one New Testament reference here for you. We're going to go to the New Testament here in a moment, but one New Testament reference just by way of reminder, and that is in Romans chapter 12 and verse 19. That begins a section where Paul tells the Romans, we just don't take vengeance. That's not what we do. God is able to take care of that himself. He does not need our help in that regard. And so we need to be sure that we don't let Satan talk us into becoming the executioner when we see wrong done, as if we're going to, on God's behalf, fix everything and make everything right. Most of the time, that is not the role we need to play. The next principle is respect for God's order does not equal approval of sin. This one's a hard one for us also. I referenced on the screen there our discussion lately about Daniel and how he handled Nebuchadnezzar. He did not agree with everything Nebuchadnezzar did. He did not agree with Darius and Cyrus. He did not agree with those folks. But him playing his role and doing his part as a servant does not mean he agreed with everything they did. And that's kind of where David is a little bit. He does not agree with what Saul is doing, but it is not his place to interject himself and to try to fix all of that. When we respect the system God has put in place, it doesn't mean we always agree with the way people, humanity, handle the system God put in place. And then the last general principle before we get to New Testament references is patient restraint and mercy are designed to test us. If you're still open to 26, 1 Samuel 26, look at this. 1 Samuel 26, we did not read this the first time around. In verse 9, David tells his servant, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? Verse 11, the Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but now please take the spear that is at his head and the jug of water and let us go. Verse 12 says this. So David took the spear and the jug of water from beside Saul's head, and they went away. But no one saw or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a sound sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. All of this was God's business, God's providential working. God intended for this meet to happen. And all of this is to either, or maybe both, provide an opportunity for David to do the right thing, which he did, and to teach the people around him to do the right thing, which he did, or to teach us what we need to learn from David and all of that. But this is God working out God's solution. And nowhere in this process did he need David to interject himself to solve the problem for God. Let me say all of that for this last observation a little bit simpler. Sometimes the greatest thing we can do is be patient and show restraint and show mercy and let God be God. And I would suggest to you that sometimes that is the hardest thing for us to do. It doesn't take a lot of character and courage to get mad and blow up. It takes character and courage to calm down and show restraint and show mercy and be patient. And that's the hard part sometimes of being a Christian or being Godward generally in a world that isn't. Because what you see a lot is things that should not be so. But God knows that. And what he needs us to do is be New Testament Christians and not try to be him. Now, with all of that, we have about 10 minutes left. And what I want us to do is look at 3 helpful New Testament references in this regard. David's position of, he is the Lord's anointed. And I'm not going to interject myself into that circumstance. I'm not going to try to solve that problem because that's not my problem to solve. That's a big one for some of us. And certain personalities struggle with that more than others. And I think some of us are tempted by Satan in that regard more than others, maybe. Or maybe we're just more susceptible to it. The idea that I can fix it. I see the wrong, and whoever has done the wrong needs to pay for the wrong done. And one of the last things we want is for someone to get away with something. We seem to be sometimes very concerned that somebody's going to get away with something, and oh no, we did not exact punishment. And these 3 references are designed to help us in view of how David handles Saul. These 3 references are designed to help us understand that often our role is to be patient, show restraint, and show mercy. That is where we need to be. And the first one I want you to look at with me is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I'm sure when I mention that, you know exactly where we're going and what we're going to discuss. We won't spend the bulk of our time on this one. It is a simple principle. 1 Corinthians in chapter 6. The first part of chapter 6 is where the Apostle Paul is dealing with these Christians who are taking one another to court. And he is appalled by all of that. It says in verse 1 of chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, he's writing to the Christians in Corinth. Does any one of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or how do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you not competent to constitute the smallest law courts? In other words, these things ought to be able to be managed inside. You ought to be able to work this out amongst yourselves. And then he says, do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? Verse 4, so if you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are of no account in the church? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not among you one wise man who will be able to decide between his brethren, but brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers? He is saying you ought to be able to work this out. And they could have worked it out. Oftentimes what gets in the way of working it out is, listen, it's not going to work out fairly for everybody, and somebody's going to get the short end of the stick, or somebody who did wrong is not going to have to fully pay for the wrong they did, and that's why we can't seem to work it out. And we know that's where it goes because of what the Apostle Paul has to say next. He says in verse 7, actually then, it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. And then he says, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? On the contrary, you yourselves wrong and defraud. You do this even to your brethren. They were in a mess. And his solution is let that go. But I'm going to be wrong. Yes. Yes, you are. Let that go. But it's not fair. That's correct. It is not fair. But let that go. Why not rather be wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? He follows it up there in verse 8 with what actually happens when we try to make it all work and we try to get everything situated just fine so that everybody pays what they ought to pay and everybody gets what they ought to get. What happens when we do that in verse 8? Well, you yourselves wrong and defraud. You do this even to your brethren. You're never going to get things even. It's good for us to understand that. We're not going to find that perfect balance every time where everybody, gets what's coming to them. Because that's not our job. We don't have the ability to make that happen. And the truth is, as we've lately discussed, we really don't want that. That's not what we want. That's not the standard we want applied to ourselves. There's an aspect of this that we sometimes miss, and that is when we're trying to be sure that nobody gets away with anything, we fail to realize that from time to time we have gotten away with something. And so when we interject that humility and that patience and that mercy and that restraint, then we can let things go. We can move along. And we can serve the Lord and be faithful to Him. The next one kind of fits with this, and we're going to have to rush just a tad bit to get through all of these. The next one is Matthew chapter 18, if you'll turn over there with you. Remember the story in Matthew chapter 18 of the servant, the slave, who was unwilling to forgive. You remember that? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 18, all the way down to verse 21. The story really quickly. It's occasioned by the question, question by Peter, how often should my brother sin against me and I forgive him? How forgiving do I have to be is the question. I mean, where is the stopping point? How far does it go? And Jesus basically says, you forgive. That's your role. Your job is to forgive. That's what you do. And so then he tells the story. You have the kingdom of heaven, he says, may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he'd begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought him. You remember the story. He can't pay the 10,000 talents. He can't do it. And the king shows him mercy. And then the man goes out, and someone owes him just a little bit. And he is unwilling to forgive. He is unwilling to show mercy. And so we stack that on top of let it go, just let it go, and why not rather be defrauded? We stack on top of that, forgive people. Let it go from a forgiveness standpoint. Because whatever it is you and I need to forgive, we have to understand also someone has had to forgive us from time to time. The thing about humanity is we all have the sin problem. We don't all have the same sin problem, but we all have the same problem, which is sin. We all do. And to any degree means that we all share in the same circumstance. And that's why this parable that Jesus tells is so poignant and so powerful, because both should have shown mercy. When the one who was forgiven was unwilling to forgive, well, he had crossed a line that just put him in a terrible spot. And that's the point of the story. And so if we expect God to forgive us, we're going to be forgiving to others, even when they aren't having to pay the full price for what they've done. We're going to let that go. And that's where David was in the cave, and that's where David was in the camp. Is Saul ever going to have to pay up? Yeah, one way or the other. This life or the next, one way or the other. God will see to that. That was not David's responsibility. And the last passage I want us to look at that kind of helps pull it all together is the parable of the tares in Matthew chapter 13. And the reason I want us to look at that is because I want to emphasize an aspect that we haven't talked about yet. I think you're well with me in the points so far, but this one we have not gotten to. What we get out of the parable of the tares in Matthew chapter 13, one of the lessons we get is that there is a possibility, a very real possibility, of doing damage to the kingdom as we go about trying to settle up and be sure everybody is sufficiently punished for what they've done wrong. There is damage done to the Lord's cause when we refuse to forgive and when we refuse to just let it go and be defrauded. When we demand that everybody has to get what's coming to them, we will inevitably do damage to the kingdom. Sometimes what's kind of sad about that is we're willing to do that because we so badly need people to be punished. When I say we, I don't necessarily mean you. You may not have that problem, but people have that problem. Therefore, sometimes Christians have that problem. We are not the executors. We are not the ones who settle all the accounts. God is. If we're going to play that role, we need to understand that somebody else is going to try to play that role against us, first of all, but also then understand that all of that going on hurts the kingdom. It disrupts the kingdom. It uproots the good that's in the kingdom. So there's great value in how David phrases it back in 1 Samuel 24 and 26 when he says, I will not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. I will not strike the Lord's anointed. That is God's business. It is not ours. And we will not engage in that. It's really valuable for us. One last thing. We have 1 minute left. Go now with me to Romans chapter 12. Turn over there with me to Romans chapter 12. We've talked about forgiveness. We've talked about showing mercy. We've talked about being patient and showing restraint. In Romans chapter 12, please. I'm going to begin reading at verse 9. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. Here's what Paul said to the Roman Christians. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. Verse 14, he says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men, if possible, so far as it depends on you. Be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But, verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. He wraps up that section by saying, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. David did that. David provided a good example for us. Thank you for your time this evening.